Imagine a man standing in the center of a grand mansion. Every wall is lined with shelves of gold bars and priceless jewels. His garage holds the latest cars, his bank account overflows with numbers too large to imagine. And yet, when the night grows quiet and no one is around, he feels something missing. The silence echoes louder than the wealth that surrounds him. Now picture another man. He owns little, his home is modest, his clothes are simple. But when a neighbor knocks at his door asking for help, he offers half of his meal without hesitation. When a child cries in the street, he bends down, offering comfort. Though he has little, he never feels poor. In fact, those around him say he shines with a richness no money can buy. So let me ask you, who is truly rich? We live in a world obsessed with wealth. We measure success by bank accounts, square footage, and brand names. But deep down, most of us sense that material possessions alone cannot fill the hollowness within. Money can build a palace, but it cannot guarantee peace in the heart. Jewels can sparkle, but they cannot ease the weight of loneliness. Fame can put a name on every screen, but it cannot assure a night of restful sleep. The Buddha once taught, if you knew the power of generosity, you would not let a single meal pass without sharing it. This teaching strikes at the very core of what it means to be wealthy. Because true wealth is not about how much we can hold, but about how much we can release. Think about it. When we cling tightly to possessions, we live in constant fear of losing them. But when we learn to give, we taste freedom. Our hands, once clenched in grasping, open wide. And suddenly the world flows through us, not against us. And here's a paradox worth noticing. The more we give, the richer we feel. Not in dollars, not in property, but in joy, in connection, in meaning. Generosity turns ordinary days into extraordinary moments. It transforms relationships, builds communities, and awakens something sacred within us. This is why Buddhism places Dāna, generosity, as the very first perfection on the path to enlightenment. Because to give is to soften the hardened shell of self. To give is to see beyond mine and yours. To give is to glimpse a freedom larger than the ego's hunger. But here's the beauty. You don't need to be a millionaire to practice this kind of wealth. A smile can be a treasure. A kind word can be a gift greater than gold. Sharing time, attention, or comfort can uplift a life more than handing out diamonds ever could. True richness, then, is not measured in what you keep locked away, but in what you allow to flow out into the world. It is a river, not a stagnant pond. And as the river flows, it nourishes not only those who drink from it, but also the one who lets it run. As we journey deeper, we will explore why material wealth so often deceives us, why generosity has always been at the heart of Buddhist wisdom, and how acts of giving, both great and small, can transform not only our own lives, but the lives of everyone we touch. But before we walk further on this path, pause for a moment and reflect. When you think of the richest person you know, do you measure their wealth by what they own or by what they share? We chase wealth as if it were the key to happiness. A bigger house, a faster car, a larger paycheck. These are the milestones society teaches us to pursue. But pause for a moment. How many times have you gotten something you desperately wanted, only to discover that the satisfaction faded almost as quickly as it came? Think back to childhood. Do you remember the excitement of getting a brand new toy? For a moment, it was everything. You carried it everywhere, showed it to everyone. But weeks later, it sat forgotten in a corner, replaced by another desire. That cycle never really ends. It just evolves into adult toys, gadgets, clothes, vacations, even status. This endless craving is what the Buddha called T, a letter 1E47HA macron, thirst. It's not thirst that can be quenched, but thirst that keeps multiplying. The more we drink, the thirstier we become. Now, society often paints material success as the ultimate measure of a person. We look at celebrities, entrepreneurs, and billionaires as if they have unlocked the secret to life. Yet behind the closed doors of mansions and palaces, we often find the same struggles: anxiety, broken relationships, even despair. The illusion is powerful. It convinces us that once we get there, happiness will be permanent. But the truth is, the finish line keeps moving. Let's look deeper. What is money really? It is paper, metal, or now even just digital numbers flashing on a screen. It only has value because society agrees it does. And yet people sacrifice their health, their families, even their integrity for the sake of these symbols. Isn't that remarkable? We trade the precious moments of life for something that, in the end, we cannot carry with us. There's an old parable in Buddhism. A man, after a long journey, comes to a river. He builds a raft out of wood and grass to cross it safely. Once on the other side, he wonders, should I carry the raft on my back because it served me well, or should I leave it behind? The Buddha explained, wealth is like that raft. It can be useful to cross certain waters in life. But once we cling to it, once we carry it on our back as if it were our identity, it becomes a burden instead of a tool. And isn't this what so many of us do? We cling to possessions as though they define who we are. We introduce ourselves through job titles, car brands, and the size of our houses. But what happens when those things vanish? What remains when the stock market crashes, when age takes away beauty, when health fades? If our worth is tied only to what we own, then we are building our lives on sand. This is why material wealth is an illusion. Not because it is evil, not because money is inherently wrong, but because we mistake it for something it is not. We confuse wealth with happiness. We confuse ownership with identity. And in doing so, we fall into the trap of endless striving. Buddhism reminds us, impermanence is the nature of all things. Gold will tarnish, houses will crumble, bodies will age. No matter how tightly we hold, time will take it all away. But here lies the hidden blessing. If nothing material is permanent, then why cling so desperately? Why not use wealth as a tool for something greater, something lasting? When we see through the illusion, we no longer chase wealth blindly. We begin to ask deeper questions. What truly nourishes the heart? What leaves a legacy beyond possessions? What kind of wealth cannot be stolen, cannot decay, cannot fade with time? The answer, as we will soon see, lies in generosity, because while possessions disappear, the act of sharing plants seeds that grow beyond our lifetimes. A kind deed echoes long after the giver has gone. And that, my friend, is the beginning of true richness. If material wealth fades, what then can we build our lives upon? The Buddha gave us a clear answer: begin with generosity. In Buddhism, generosity is not just a moral suggestion, it is the very foundation of the path. It is called Dāna Pāramitā, the perfection of giving. And it is no accident that this is placed as the first of the 6 perfections, even before wisdom, patience, or meditation. Why? Because without opening the hand, we cannot open the heart. And without opening the heart, the deeper teachings of the Dharma cannot truly take root. Now, generosity in Buddhism is not measured by the size of the gift, but by the spirit of giving. A small offering given with a pure heart is far more valuable than a lavish donation made with pride or expectation. It's not about the amount, it's about intention. Do we give to be admired, or do we give to lighten another's burden? Do we give to increase our own status, or do we give because we see ourselves in the one who suffers? There's a beautiful story from the time of the Buddha. One day, a poor woman wanted to offer food to the Sangha, but she had almost nothing, just a small piece of stale bread. Still, she placed it in the alms bowl with complete sincerity, her heart overflowing with gratitude for the chance to give. The Buddha smiled, recognizing that her gift, though humble, was greater in merit than the grand offerings made by kings who gave with attachment to their pride. Why? Because her giving was pure. It came from a place of love, not calculation. This is the essence of Dāna. It transforms both the giver and the receiver. The receiver's suffering is eased, but the giver experiences something even more profound: the loosening of greed, the release of clinging, the taste of freedom. Buddhism often speaks of the 3 kinds of giving. First, the giving of material support: food, shelter, clothing, medicine. These sustain the body. Second, the giving of dharma, sharing wisdom, compassion, and truth. This sustains the mind. And third, the giving of fearlessness, offering safety, comfort, or protection to those who are afraid. This sustains the heart. When you think about it, even a simple act of listening to someone's pain without judgment is an act of giving fearlessness. It tells them, "You are not alone. You are safe with me." And sometimes that is the greatest gift of all. The Buddha himself embodied generosity at every step. In countless Jataka tales, the stories of his past lives, he sacrificed his own comfort and even his life for the sake of others. These stories remind us that generosity is not an obligation, it is the natural expression of an awakened heart. When compassion flows freely, giving becomes as natural as breathing. But let's be honest, giving is not always easy. Our minds resist. A voice whispers, "If I give, I'll have less. What if I need it later?" This is the fear of scarcity. But here is the secret. When we give with trust, life has a mysterious way of replenishing us. It may not return in the exact form we expect, but it always returns, sometimes as peace of mind, sometimes as love from others, sometimes as an unexpected blessing when we need it most. Modern psychology even confirms what the Buddha taught centuries ago. Acts of generosity release chemicals in the brain: dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin that create a natural helper's high. In other words, giving literally makes us happier. It is not only spiritually wise but biologically true. So what does this mean for us here and now? It means that every day offers a chance to practice Dāna. You don't need wealth or power to give. Offer your seat on the bus. Share a meal with someone who is hungry. Give your time to listen, your words to uplift, your presence to comfort. Each act is a seed planted in the soil of your life. And over time, those seeds blossom into a garden of richness no bank account could ever match. True generosity, then, is not just about giving away things, it's about giving away ourselves. Our love, our patience, our attention. It's about stepping beyond the narrow prison of me and mine and discovering the joy of we and ours. And here is the paradox again. The more you give, the less you feel you lack. Because generosity is not subtraction, it is multiplication. It multiplies joy, multiplies love, multiplies meaning. It is, in every sense, the beginning of true wealth. So when we think of richness, let's no longer imagine only gold and treasures locked away. Let us imagine hands open, hearts wide, and lives flowing outward in kindness. For that is the wealth no thief can steal, no fire can burn, and no time can destroy. Stories have a way of reaching us where theories cannot. They slip past the intellect and speak directly to the heart. And when it comes to generosity, the Buddha left us a treasury of stories that shine like lanterns across centuries, reminding us of what it truly means to give. One of the most moving tales comes from the Jataka stories, which recount the Buddha's past lives. In one such life, he was born as a compassionate prince. One day, while walking in the forest, he saw a starving tigress lying weakly on the ground. Her cubs cried out beside her, too hungry to move. The prince knew she had no strength left to hunt, and without food, she and her cubs would surely die. In that moment, he faced a choice most of us could hardly imagine. Rather than walking away, rather than clinging to his own life, the prince offered his body so that the tigress and her cubs might live. He gave not just his possessions, but his very existence. It is a story so extreme that it shocks us. Would anyone today make such a sacrifice? Yet that is the power of the tale. It stretches the imagination, showing us the limitless potential of generosity when compassion becomes boundless. But not all stories of giving are so dramatic. Many are quiet, hidden in the folds of daily life. Take the story of King Ashoka, one of India's greatest rulers. History remembers him not for his conquests, but for his transformation. After witnessing the suffering caused by war, Ashoka embraced Buddhism and dedicated his reign to generosity. He built hospitals for both people and animals. He planted trees along roads for shade, dug wells for travelers, and supported monasteries where wisdom could flourish. His legacy of generosity shaped an empire, proving that true power is not in taking, but in giving. And then there are stories closer to our own time. Consider the tale of a poor farmer who had only a small harvest. A neighbor, even poorer, came seeking food. Though he had just enough to feed his own family, the farmer divided his grain, saying, "We can survive with less, but together we will survive with dignity." Such acts rarely make headlines, yet they echo with the same spirit of generosity that moved kings and saints. Perhaps the most touching stories are the ones we witness ourselves. A stranger paying for someone's meal in a crowded restaurant. A child donating their favorite toy to comfort another. A person stopping to listen, truly listen to someone who feels invisible. These moments may seem small, but to the receiver they can be life-changing. And to the giver, they awaken a joy no possession can match. Think of your own life. Can you recall a moment when someone gave to you, not because they had to, not because they wanted something in return, but simply because they cared? Maybe it was a teacher who stayed late to help, a friend who lent an ear during your darkest hour, or even a stranger whose kindness carried you through a difficult day. Do you remember how it felt? That is the power of generosity. It leaves an imprint deeper than wealth, deeper than fame. The Buddha taught that generosity is not bound by time or status. A king giving away treasures, a beggar sharing half a crust of bread, they both embody the same truth. The act itself transcends the value of the object. What matters is the heart behind it. This is why stories of giving endure. They remind us that wealth does not lie in possession but in expression. They awaken something ancient in us, something that whispers, "This is who you truly are, not a hoarder of things but a sharer of life." And when we see generosity lived out, in ancient India, in royal palaces, in humble villages, or on the street corners of our own cities, we realize that this spirit is timeless. It has always been here, waiting in the human heart. And every time someone chooses to give, the world tilts just slightly toward compassion, toward connection, toward light. So when we hear these stories, let us not think of them as distant legends or noble acts beyond our reach. Instead, let us see them as invitations. Invitations to become storytellers ourselves, not with words but with deeds. Because the next great story of generosity might be written not in scriptures or history books, but in the quiet way you choose to share something of yourself today. For centuries, the Buddha taught that generosity is the root of joy. But today, science has begun to catch up with this ancient wisdom. Modern psychology, neuroscience, and social research are revealing what the Dharma has always known. Giving is not just good for others, it transforms us from the inside out. Think about the last time you gave something, anything, with sincerity. Maybe it was a gift, a meal, or simply your time. Do you remember that warm, uplifting feeling that lingered long after the act? Scientists call this the helper's high. It's a real, measurable effect. When we give, our brains release chemicals like dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin, the very same chemicals that create feelings of pleasure, connection, and love. In other words, generosity lights up the brain's reward system just as powerfully as receiving does, sometimes even more. There was a fascinating study at Harvard where participants were given money and asked either to spend it on themselves or on someone else. The results were striking. Those who spent on others reported feeling significantly happier than those who spent on themselves. The lesson was clear. The joy of giving lasts longer than the thrill of buying. Why is that? Because at our core, human beings are wired for connection. We are not separate islands. We are a web of relationships. When we give, we strengthen that web. We affirm that life is not about competition, but about belonging. And belonging is one of the deepest human needs. But generosity doesn't just lift the spirit, it also strengthens the body. Research shows that people who practice regular acts of kindness have lower blood pressure, reduced stress levels, and even longer lifespans. It's as if the body itself rewards us for caring beyond ourselves. The Buddha might say this is karma at work, good actions planting seeds that blossom into well-being. And generosity doesn't have to be grand to have this effect. Even small acts, a smile to a stranger, holding a door, a word of encouragement, activate this cycle of joy. In fact, studies suggest that consistent small acts of kindness make us happier than rare, large gestures. It's not about the size of the gift, but about living in a posture of giving. There's another fascinating discovery. Generosity is contagious. When one person gives, it often inspires others to do the same. A single act of kindness ripples outward, influencing friends, families, even entire communities. Think of it like lighting a candle. One flame can ignite another, and another until a whole room is filled with light. This ripple effect is why a single generous act can end up changing countless lives. From a Buddhist lens, this makes perfect sense. Because when we give, we dissolve the illusion of separateness. We see ourselves in others and others in ourselves. Science might explain it as neurons firing and hormones flowing, but the Dharma explains it as compassion awakening. Two languages pointing to the same truth. But perhaps the most profound part of this discovery is what it reveals about what it means to be human. So many of us believe that happiness comes from accumulation, from getting, buying, owning. Yet science and spirituality agree. Happiness arises more deeply from giving than from having. The heart feels fullest when it is pouring out, not when it is hoarding in. And here is the paradox once again. When we give, we do not end up with less, we end up with more. More joy, more connection, more meaning. It is the kind of wealth that grows as we share it, the kind that expands the more it flows. So, as we move forward, remember this. Generosity is not a sacrifice. It is not a loss. It is a profound exchange, where the giver gains as much as, if not more than, the receiver. In every act of sharing, we are rewiring our minds, softening our hearts, and stepping closer to the freedom the Buddha pointed toward. And if wealth is meant to bring happiness, then surely this is the richest kind of wealth there is. The wealth of giving, the science of joy, the Dharma alive in our very neurons. Generosity in Buddhism is not limited to dropping coins in a bowl or writing checks to charity. The Buddha taught that giving comes in many forms, each with its own power to heal, to connect, and to awaken. Traditionally, these are called the three kinds of Dāna, three doors through which we can share the richness of our being. 1. Material giving, supporting the body. The first form is the most obvious, giving material things. Food, clothing, shelter, medicine, these sustain life. In the Buddha's time, lay followers supported the monks and nuns with daily alms, ensuring they had the basics needed to continue their spiritual practice. In return, the Sangha shared the Dharma with the community, creating a cycle of mutual giving. But material giving is not only about monks in robes or rituals from the past. It's about daily life. When you give a meal to someone hungry, when you help a neighbor fix their roof, when you donate clothes to a family in need, you are practicing this first kind of generosity. It reminds us that none of us survive alone. The body is fragile, and caring for the body, our own and others, is a sacred act. Yet material giving also teaches us detachment. Every time we release something we could have kept, we loosen the grip of greed. We learn that joy does not come from ownership, but from flow. 2. Dharma giving, nourishing the mind. The second form is deeper still, the giving of Dharma. This is not limited to monks preaching or teachers giving lectures. At its heart, Dharma giving means sharing wisdom, compassion, and guidance that can lift someone's mind out of confusion or suffering. Imagine a person lost in despair, thinking their life has no worth. Now imagine someone offering a few words that rekindle hope. You are not alone. Your life matters. That is Dharma giving. Or picture a parent teaching a child patience, a friend reminding another to breathe through anger, a stranger sharing a story that brings courage. Each of these is a form of giving the Dharma. The Buddha himself said that the gift of Dharma surpasses all material gifts. Why? Because material support sustains for a day, but wisdom sustains for a lifetime. Feed someone once and their hunger returns tomorrow. But give them insight, compassion, or skill, and you feed their spirit for as long as they live. In our time, this might mean sharing knowledge freely, teaching skills that empower others, or even creating art, stories, and conversations that uplift hearts. Whenever you help someone see life more clearly, you are offering the second type of generosity. 3. Fearlessness giving, liberating the heart. The third form is perhaps the most profound, the gift of fearlessness. This is when we remove the fear, anxiety, or insecurity that weighs on another's heart. Sometimes, this looks like physical protection, standing up for someone being bullied, defending the vulnerable, or offering shelter to those in danger. Other times, it looks like emotional support, being the steady presence when someone feels lost, assuring them that they are safe, that they are seen. Fear is one of humanity's greatest burdens. When we ease that burden, we give something priceless. Think of the relief in a child's eyes when they know someone will protect them. Think of the comfort in a friend's heart when they realize they don't have to face suffering alone. This is the gift of fearlessness, and it doesn't always require grand actions. Even a smile in a dark moment can be a signal. You are not alone, you are safe. That simple act can dissolve fear more deeply than any possession could. Together, these three types of giving, material support, dharma, and fearlessness, form a complete picture of what it means to be truly generous. One nourishes the body, one nourishes the mind, one nourishes the heart. And when we give in all three ways, we are not only helping others, we are shaping ourselves into beings of boundless compassion. Because here is the secret. Every time we give, no matter the form, we step out of the narrow prison of self. We touch the truth of interconnection. And in that moment, we taste freedom. So, reflect for a moment. Which form of generosity do you find yourself practicing most often? Which one calls to you now? Remember, it does not matter if you are rich or poor, young or old. The chance to give, through body, mind, or heart, is always within reach. And as we journey further, we will begin to see why this act of giving is not just noble. It is the very definition of true wealth. What is it that makes wealth feel real? Is it the number in a bank account or the laughter of someone you've helped? Is it the shine of jewelry or the sparkle in another's eyes when their suffering is eased? The Buddha pointed to a truth so simple, yet so often ignored. True wealth is found not in possession, but in participation. It is not what we hold, but what we release. Not what we keep, but what we share. Think about a flame. If you light one candle from it, the original flame doesn't weaken. In fact, the light multiplies. The room grows brighter with each candle lit. This is the nature of generosity. When we share, our own flame does not diminish, it expands, illuminating the world around us. History is full of figures who owned empires but lived in fear. Kings guarded their treasures day and night, afraid of thieves, terrified of loss. They slept on golden beds, yet their hearts knew no rest. This is the poverty of the rich. The more they cling, the less they truly enjoy. Now contrast this with a humble villager who shares what little they have. Even with half a bowl of rice, their heart feels light because they know they have enough. They know they are part of a larger whole. They know that joy is multiplied when divided. The paradox is clear. The more tightly you hold, the emptier you feel. The more you release, the richer your life becomes. Wealth, like blood in the body, is meant to circulate. If blood stops flowing, the body sickens. If wealth stops flowing when it is hoarded, locked away, the spirit sickens. Generosity is the heartbeat that keeps life alive, that keeps relationships vibrant, that keeps society whole. In Buddhism, this circulation is not just practical but spiritual. Every gift loosens the ego's grip. Every act of sharing polishes the mirror of the heart, reflecting more clearly our interconnection with all beings. The rich who hoard live in isolation. The generous, no matter how little they own, live in abundance. Because abundance is not about how much you have, it's about how much you can give without fear. Material wealth is fragile. It can vanish in a fire, be stolen by thieves, collapse with markets. But the wealth of generosity, the wealth of kindness, compassion, and connection, cannot be taken from you. It becomes part of your very being. The Buddha once said, "The fragrance of flowers spreads only in the direction of the wind, but the fragrance of virtue spreads in all directions." When you give, you leave behind an invisible perfume, a trail of goodness that continues long after the act itself is forgotten. That is true richness, wealth that survives even death, carried in the memory of those touched by your kindness. Here is something beautiful. When you give, you are not losing, you are exchanging. You trade something temporary for something eternal. A coin turns into gratitude. A meal turns into a smile. A kind word turns into hope. And these things return to you in ways no bank could calculate. It is no accident that in Buddhist teachings, generosity is considered the foundation of spiritual practice. Because without opening the hand, you cannot open the heart. And without opening the heart, awakening remains only a concept, never a lived reality. So ask yourself, when the final page of your life is written, what will define your richness? The things you stored in closets and vaults, or the lives you touched, the fears you eased, the joy you ignited? True richness is not measured in what you keep. It is revealed in what you give. And the moment you begin to live this truth, even the smallest gesture, a smile, a word, a helping hand, becomes proof that you are already deeply, profoundly wealthy. We've seen that true richness is not about what we hold, but about what we share. But here comes the real question. How do we live this out every single day? Generosity is not reserved for saints or billionaires. It doesn't require a stage, a spotlight, or a fortune. It is built from simple choices, repeated with intention. And the beauty is, opportunities to give are everywhere, hidden in plain sight. In a world that runs at lightning speed, time is one of the rarest treasures. To give someone your full attention is to tell them, "You matter, I see you." When you put down your phone during a conversation, when you listen without interrupting, when you sit with someone in silence without rushing away, you are giving one of the most profound gifts, presence. Think of the child who beams when their parent listens to their small story. Think of the elderly neighbor who lights up when someone stops to talk. A few minutes of genuine presence can feel richer than gold. Words can heal or harm, build or break. Choosing to speak with kindness is a form of generosity often overlooked. Encouragement given at the right time can change the direction of someone's life. Imagine a student who feels like giving up until a teacher says, "I believe in you." Or a friend drowning in self-doubt, lifted by your reminder, "You are stronger than you think." These words cost nothing, yet they carry the weight of worlds. To practice generosity with words means to speak truthfully, gently, and with compassion. It also means withholding words that would wound. Sometimes silence itself is an act of kindness. Small actions ripple outward in ways we may never see. Holding the door open, carrying someone's heavy bag, cooking a meal for a tired friend, even offering your seat on a crowded bus. These are not grand sacrifices. They are reminders that we live together, not alone. In Buddhism, such actions are considered as meaningful as giving treasures because they come from the same source, a heart willing to serve. Of course, there is also the giving of material support. It might be donating money to a cause, offering food to the hungry, or lending tools to a neighbor. But here's the key. Generosity does not depend on amount. The Buddha praised a poor man who gave a single coin with sincerity as much as he praised a wealthy king who gave thousands. It is not the size of the gift, but the spirit behind it. When the heart is open, even the smallest gift becomes immeasurable. And then there is the most subtle, yet perhaps most powerful way of giving, compassion itself. When you forgive instead of holding a grudge, you give peace. When you show patience to someone struggling, you give space to grow. When you wish happiness for another, even silently, you are participating in the deepest generosity, the wish for all beings to be free from suffering. This is something anyone can practice, anywhere at any time, in the middle of traffic, at the checkout line, in the quiet of your own heart. The secret is not to wait for perfect moments, but to weave generosity into the fabric of daily life. Start small, start where you are. A smile, a kind note, a moment of patience. Every act is a seed, and seeds grow into forests. And here's the miracle. The more you give, the more natural it becomes. Generosity stops feeling like an effort and starts feeling like your very nature, like breathing, like the sun shining without being asked. So, as you step into tomorrow, notice the opportunities that surround you. Who could use a kind word? who could use a listening ear, who could be lifted by a small act of care. Generosity is not distant, not abstract. It is alive in each moment. And when practiced daily, it turns ordinary life into sacred ground. In Zen, there is a saying, "To hold nothing is to have everything." At first, it sounds like a riddle. How can emptiness be fullness? How can letting go make us rich? Yet this is the very heart of Zen wisdom. True generosity is not only about giving things away. It is about releasing the very clinging that keeps us bound. Because the greatest gift you can offer the world is freedom. Picture a man carrying a heavy sack of gold on his back. At first, he feels proud. He thinks, "Look how wealthy I am." But as the miles stretch on, the weight begins to crush him. He stumbles, sweat dripping, unable to rest. Now imagine he sets the sack down. In that instant, his body is lighter, his breath deeper, his spirit freer. The wealth was never his treasure, it was his prison. This is how attachment works. We cling to possessions, to identities, to opinions, to relationships, believing they make us whole. But often, the more tightly we grasp, the more suffering we create. Zen teaches, letting go is the ultimate act of generosity because it liberates not only you but everyone around you. Ordinary giving often carries subtle strings. We give and expect recognition. We share and secretly hope for gratitude. We help but wait for return. But in Zen, true giving has no ledger. It is like a tree offering shade. It does not ask if you are worthy, it simply gives. It is like a flower's fragrance. It spreads without discrimination, without concern for reward. When we let go of the desire for acknowledgement, our generosity becomes pure. The act itself is enough. And in that purity, we taste a joy far deeper than any thank you could bring. Zen masters often spoke of the empty hand. It may look like nothing is there, but in emptiness lies infinite possibility. A clenched fist can hold only a few coins. An open hand can receive the whole sky. Letting go clears space. Space for love to flow, space for wisdom to arise, space for life to unfold without resistance. When the heart is uncluttered, generosity flows not as effort but as a natural expression, like water streaming down a mountain. Think of relationships. When we cling, we suffocate. But when we release the need to control, love becomes spacious, alive, and free. That freedom itself is a gift to ourselves and to those we love. Think of ideas. When we hold rigidly to our views, we argue, divide, and fight. But when we let go of needing to be right, we give the world the gift of peace. Think of life itself. When we cling to permanence, we live in fear of loss. But when we embrace impermanence, we discover gratitude. Every moment becomes precious. Every breath becomes a miracle. Zen ultimately points to the greatest release, letting go of the self. The illusion of I and mine is the deepest attachment of all. When this illusion drops away, what remains is vastness, boundlessness, compassion without limit. The Buddha once compared the self to a tightly clenched fist. It seems solid, but when you open it, when you let go, nothing is left to grasp, and yet everything is free. This is the supreme generosity, to live without the prison of ego, to offer yourself as a field where all beings may find peace. So, from the Zen perspective, the richest person is not the one who has the most, nor even the one who gives the most possessions. It is the one who has let go completely. For in letting go, they have already given the greatest gift, freedom. And with this understanding, our journey turns toward its final chapter, where we gather all these insights and ask, what does it mean to live a life of true richness every single day? We began with a question. What does it mean to be truly rich? Along the way, we've seen emperors who lived in fear despite their treasures, and ordinary people who shone with abundance though they had little. We've seen that true wealth is not measured in what we store, but in what we release. Not in what we keep, but in what we share. Now, as our journey closes, let us remember this simple truth. The only wealth that lasts is the wealth that cannot be stolen. Gold can be taken, houses can burn, fame can fade. Even the body which we guard so fiercely will one day return to the earth. If we anchor our identity to these things, we live in constant fear. Fear of losing, fear of not having enough, fear of impermanence. This is not richness. This is poverty dressed in silk. But generosity, compassion, and wisdom, these cannot be stolen. When you give with sincerity, no thief can undo that act. When you speak a kind word, its echo travels beyond your lifetime. When you release your clinging, you taste a freedom no circumstance can take away. This is why the Buddha taught that the fragrance of virtue spreads in all directions. It is invisible, yet unmistakable. It lingers long after possessions have vanished, long after names have been forgotten. Imagine your life as a flame. If you hoard it, shielding it in fear, the flame grows weak. But if you use it to light other candles, the room grows brighter, and your flame still burns strong. True richness is measured in this light: how many lives you've touched, how many burdens you've lifted, how many moments of joy you've left behind. It does not matter how much money you had, how many titles you carried, or how many things you owned. What matters is the wealth of the heart you cultivated and the freedom you shared. At the end of our journey, when all possessions fall away, the greatest wealth we carry with us is the goodness we've given. That is the treasure death cannot steal, the fortune that requires no bank, no vault, no guard. It is the wealth of having lived fully, generously, fearlessly. So ask yourself, what legacy of richness do you wish to leave? What kind of fragrance will your life release into the world? To be truly rich is to share. To be truly rich is to let go. To be truly rich is to live in a way that no thief, no fire, no storm can ever erase. And perhaps the greatest secret of all is this: you don't need to wait until you have more. You are already rich here and now, the moment you choose to give. If these words touch something within you, let them be more than passing thoughts. Carry them into your life, into your heart, into your daily practice. And if you wish to continue walking this path with us, exploring the wisdom of the Buddha, the peace of Zen, and the richness of a generous heart, I invite you to join our community here at Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Subscribe, not for numbers, not for vanity, but so that together we can keep lighting candles in a world that longs for light. May your days be filled with peace. May your heart overflow with compassion. And may you discover, again and again, the wealth that cannot be stolen.